going to try something. Привитание. Hang on, I'm not done. Дякуй за запросение Минска. I hope what I said is hi, and thank you so much for inviting me. As you can see, I have had a wonderful time in Minsk so far. Before I carry on, I have to warn you that my slides have a lot of flashing content, pretty much incessant flashing content. There's a GIF on every slide. So if you're photosensitive, I'm really, really sorry. Anyway, it's an absolute honor to be here. It's my first international speaking opportunity, and it couldn't have been a better conference. And after all these amazing speakers, it's an absolute honor to be closing off the CSS track of this conference today. And I know that your brains are probably buzzing with a lot of technical detail and questions, and we're all looking forward to the after party. So that's no pressure on me at all, but I want to talk about something today that I really care about, and that's very important to our community. And I promise you, hear me out, and it will be worth your time. Me. So my name's Dora Militaru. I'm a full-stack developer. I mostly work with JavaScript, a handful of other languages, and I do tend to have brightly colored hair. Not this time, but usually, hence the emoji. I work at the Financial Times, which is a global news organization, and Financial Times are known for its integrity and accuracy. And the coolest thing about this picture is obviously the broadsheet, the Financial Times, which is our main publication, and it's been around for 130 years. It's pink, but you can't see that. And this is where I have been working for the past almost year and a half now. This is our office. This photo has no filter because this is the London weather. The FT have a sort of vibrant and really exciting engineering culture, and I've had the opportunity to work on many projects, amongst which GDPR. My main passion, I would say, is web performance, but I'm not going to talk about that. If you want to know about that, we have a fairly well-written engineering blog that you can Google, or you can hit me up afterwards when we're having beers. What I'm going to talk about today instead is something that comes from very personal experience, and it comes from a little while back, so it's throwback time to about 2016 in winter, when I went to my first ever web performance meetup. And it was hosted at the FT. I wasn't yet working for the FT. It's called London Web Perf. And I entered the room and noticed very swiftly that I was the only girl in that room. And I sat down at the back because I'd gotten there a little bit later, and I was really excited to learn about service workers and PWAs. And I'd forgotten my glasses, and I was so shy that I didn't want to go forward so I could see what the slides were about. And then I had some questions, but I didn't think they were clever enough to ask, so I didn't ask them. And then I didn't stay for the beers and pizza because everybody looked like they knew each other, and also I was on a diet. So I don't know if anyone else can relate to this in this room. And it was the first time, but definitely not the last time, I've entered a room and asked myself the question, where are the women? So I finally wrote a talk about it. Here goes. A year later, 2017, it was an exciting year in the news, very interesting rather than exciting. So we had all the fumblings of the Trump presidency, and then in the UK we had Brexit, and then all of Europe was just facing and not really facing a refugee crisis. And my own home country, which is Romania, had the most terrible social unrest since like 1989, the year of the revolution. So the entire world was just awash with a sense of uncertainty. Now, on the radio, it was not such an interesting year, but for me personally, it was a very interesting and transformative year. With everything sort of going on in the UK, I didn't know if I would be staying there, and I decided to leave my job, which was a product owner in a tech startup, and pursue my career dream of writing code for a living. So I'm kind of known for having really good timing, because not nearly a month after this decision, something happened. Someone called James Damore, a Google employee, wrote a manifesto that was then leaked. And if you're not familiar with it, please find it, read it, watch something funny on YouTube afterwards to clear your head. It was polarizing. So in a nutshell, James Damore argues that because women are fundamentally, physiologically and psychologically different from men, this somehow explains why there are fewer women in tech and why women are less likely to succeed as software engineers. So I was like really confused and feeling even more like an imposter. And Twitter just blew up. My Twitter was dead. Everyone on the internet was talking about this. Everyone had an opinion, and people clearly felt very strongly about diversity, and sort of enough, they felt strongly enough about it to have heated arguments with complete strangers. And just because everyone was talking about diversity to a greater extent than we ever had before, and sort of with a broader sense of understanding than we ever had before, that was a good thing, because it means that we as a society can acknowledge that there is a problem, and we also care enough to talk about it. So anyway, in tech, we're still spending a lot of time arguing about and for diversity. And I don't know if anyone's into rap music, so there's Big Sean says, "I'm here for a good time, not a long time," and that's how I like to live my life. So I really wanted to get a deeper understanding of where the debate is going, what is the dialectic involved, what are the issues that people are discussing, and along what lines, and what's worth discussing and what isn't. So hence this talk. Firstly, I noticed that people talk a lot about numbers, and it's only fair that I start with the FT. I obviously love the FT, that's not a secret. But how diverse is the FT really? Globally, we have an almost even gender split. In fact, there's slightly more women. At senior management level, the female representation is 36%, which is still higher than the UK government's voluntary target by 2020. And by 2022, the FT have committed to reaching gender parity in the senior leadership team. That means 50-50 senior management. And this is what is known as a diversity quota. And when you bring that up, this is what tends to happen. People have very strong feelings about diversity quotas, and talking about them. I have strong feelings about that. And it's ground zero for any anti-diversity trolling. And it is that for many reasons. It's very difficult to actually talk about quotas without stabbing yourself in the hand. Why is that? It seems very counterintuitive that we would have numeric requirements on hiring and promoting people based on characteristics like gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on. And also, sorry, I have forgotten my water. 1 second. Oops, break. Anyway, so I have read and heard many arguments to the tune of I or so-and-so was only hired because they were a token person, a woman, and what's worse is I've even heard accusation to the same tune. But I think the biggest fundamental problem with arguing and talking about diversity quotas is that they don't necessarily reflect reality in the way that they should. And the biggest danger is us thinking that our work is done once we've hit a target, like boom, we fixed unfairness and inequality and our job here is done. And I want to give an example here. So, is everyone familiar with AMC's TV show Mad Men? Okay, if you're not, I can recommend it. It's one of my favorite TV shows. It's about an ad agency called Sterling Cooper. It's set in the late 50s, early 60s. And it's a very well-written show. And Sterling Cooper are a perfect example of gender parity. Every man has a secretary. So you can't trust diversity quotas at face value because the window dressing for equality isn't the same as true equality. You always have to ask extra questions. Like, for example, what's your pay gap? In the UK, 9 out of 10 women work for companies that pay them less for the same job. And 50% of men work in companies where the gender pay gap is more than 10% in their favor. And these are quite worrying numbers. But anyway, before you just dismiss any discussion and stop talking about quotas, if someone asks you to have an argument for argument's sake, you have to ask yourself a couple of questions. And the first one is, do we truly live in a society where privilege plays no part in opportunity? The second one is, does merit truly equal effort plus ability? And the answer, as I believe you all know, to both questions is no. And as long as that is true, quotas may be the only way of achieving eventually a world where they are obsolete. I urge you to remember this quote somehow. Remember Laurie Penny. She's a political writer and essayist. She wrote an excellent article where I got this from, and it is a very mind-opening read on diversity issues in general. Yeah, so I've talked a lot about men and women, and we talk a lot about men and women because we spent thousands of years shaping and rationalizing gender roles, and it's very difficult to get out of that mindset. But the truth is, diversity is not that. Diversity is very much intersectional. And when you argue for diversity along a binary dimension or another, you in fact argue for a kind of diversity that benefits one group of people over others. And you choose to ignore completely the challenges that may arise from, say, being a woman and a person of color, or non-binary and disabled. The kind of diversity that is really worth fighting for is diversity which makes it possible that more people from different walks of life, from different social classes, of different races, religions, ethnicities, of any ability and any or no gender, really, can rub shoulders in management meetings or fashion shows. And that is the kind of diversity that is worth arguing for. And eventually it means that one day we, maybe working class kids won't have to get working class jobs. And maybe one day we will live in a society that is free of discrimination and stigma. So yeah, in general, people talk about numbers, and people talk about intersectional diversity, which is not ascribable to numbers. But what do we talk about in tech? I Googled it. So if you Google why is diversity important in tech, there's like a bazillion results, and they're pretty much all on the same line, which is because it's good for business. Now, there are economic science and several studies on diversity and common sense that says that if you tap into your entire pool of human resources and talent, your organization is going to become better as a result. And there are, vast and peer-reviewed and very reputable studies by the likes of BCG and Deloitte that show that companies which are more diverse and have an ethnically and gender diverse leadership structure outperform their peers financially and in terms of innovation. And also the reverse is also true. Companies with the least diverse leadership structures, and this is according to a study by McKinsey, are 25% more likely to underperform financially below their industry medians, which is huge. Okay, so having these studies and talking about diversity in this way is very useful for when you need to garner executive support for a diversity initiative. But to paraphrase a dear colleague of mine, it's good for business is the line you use with people who have so little interest in making the world better for anyone but themselves that it's good for business is the only line you have. And it's good for business is not going to convince me or you of anything. That's very unlikely. It's not going to create a diverse workplace from the ground up, and it's not going to do anything to fix inequality and unfairness outside of it. And also it's like really boring, because to quote the same colleague, as someone outside your company, I don't care if it needs me or people like me to be better itself. So yeah, caring about diversity actually requires arguing for it in a moral sense and understanding that at the heart of it, at the bottom of the issue, is a matter of inequality. That's because there is systemic inequality in access to education and access to employment, and we have persistent stereotypes around race and wealth and social class that affect whether people are able to get a job or get the right education. And also, our very institutions come with unequal outcomes built in that benefit some people more than others. So in that sense, arguing for diversity and about diversity should absolutely be a moral duty. And the more people care, the better. The more people understand that diversity problem is perpetuated by inequality and injustice, and in turn perpetuates inequality and injustice, the better we have a chance of actually changing things, because ignorance is part of the oppression. So you should absolutely feel very strongly about talking about diversity as a barometer for wider societal issues. The only trouble is that often we say and do things not for their intrinsic value, but for what they say about us. And that is called virtue signaling, and it's very unhelpful, and it happens all over social media. Like Twitter is a lot of, I'll show you how right on I am. And often there is just so much noise that we fail to notice that the changes we thought we enacted may not be sufficient anymore. And that is very dangerous. So, yeah, there's a lot of this self-congratulatory focus on diversity, and it is fundamentally very unhelpful to the cause. And that's because the gap between caring and the gap between solving is in the follow-up, because purpose is nothing without considering considerate implementation. Okay, so I went to Delta V, which is a new web performance conference in London, and I saw Tim Cadleck speak, and something really stuck with me from his talk. And he said that change from the top down is rarely altruistic. So I really wanted to take a look, flip it on its head, and see if we can put a more selfish spin on the arguing for diversity problem. And I thought that diversity of thought and experience and knowledge is the way we should look at that. And that's something that all of us strive for as individuals, and we do that through the experiences that we have in life and the activities we choose to pursue and the people we connect with and the knowledge we seek. And we spend a lot of our time at work, so disproportionately over anything else. And we forge relationships at work, and we create these circles of trust, and we end up trusting people implicitly and relying on them to exchange ideas, to make decisions, to tackle problems, and to socialize. And then we seek out our leaders for support and advocacy, and we come to relish their support. And in turn, when we can, we offer our support to others. We offer emotional support, we make friends, and we make cliques. So what this essentially means is that we naturally create networks, and they're informal and sometimes social networks through which we diversify our knowledge and our thought and our experience. And this sort of networking was the body of research of someone called Professor David Krakauer of Carnegie Mellon University. In the 90s, he coined the term cognitive social structures and kind of went from there and produced a vast body of research around how the way that people connect at work impacts the economic performance of their organization. And I came across a super interesting study on Harvard Business Review, which is free to look at. It's by an executive search firm called Heidrick & Struggles. And in a nutshell, what they did was they surveyed a larger professional services company, it doesn't matter, but the method was very simple. They asked every employee a list of questions to which the answer could be the name or names of another employee. And the questions were of the kind, with 1 day of training, whose role could you step into? Who would you confide about a work-related issue? Who would you ask for support if you thought a proposal of yours might be unpopular? So things like that. What they were doing, they were gathering network data. And then their data scientists produced these visualizations of network data and sort of chopped and changed and experimented with how to look at it. And they looked at how men and women are interconnected and what the distributions are at various layers of the informal networks within the company using graph theory. I tried to do the same with the FT. Obviously, they wouldn't let me have real actual data or do a survey, but I used the statistic of a 36% female representation that we have in the senior leadership team. And I made a few simulations. They all looked very, very similar in terms of interconnectedness and distribution. So I picked this one. Does anything jump out? So the result is always that women have less inbound connections than men. And you're going to say, yeah, but that's obvious because there's fewer of them. But how about where they're distributed on the map? They always seem to be gravitating towards the edges. And that was really food for thought. And I went back to the article, and their findings were also very similar. So in a decision-making network, it turned out that there were 14% more same-gender ties than they would have expected without giving any consideration to gender. In the idea-sharing network, it was 22% more same-gender ties. And also, if you look at it, women are completely absent from some areas. They tend to be peripheral again, and they tend to be isolated and have fewer inbound connections overall. And this means that fewer people go to them to ask for new ideas, which was just mind-blowing for me to realize. Anyway, so while that sinks in, there's a hypothesis that even if you had the same number of men and women, you will still have a disproportionate number of same-gender ties. And why is that? Because if diversity is bricks, something called inclusion is mortar. And it turns out that we as humans are naturally quite crap at being inclusive. We have something called a similarity bias, where we tend to gravitate naturally towards people like us. And this creates echo chambers that I'm sure you may be aware of, say, on social media. We also have other subtle biases and blind spots when it comes to people who are unlike us. And these are to the extent that we unconsciously not thrive at building relationships with people who are different to us, and we judge them more harshly. And then minority groups, they tend to conform, and they do this often just to cope, but it's usually to avoid being stereotyped, and they adopt the traits and behaviors of the majority. Why is this? I don't know, think about female investment bankers if you know any. It is because society or certain workplaces end up portraying the the majority group, often unwittingly, as the prototype for success. And in doing so, they just deny everybody else the right to belong. So it's really no surprise to anyone now that for minority groups, opportunity doesn't necessarily translate into professional achievement. All of this, like, prototype for success stuff reminded me of an ad campaign that O2, which is a telecoms provider in the UK, did, which was called Be More Dog. And I love cats. It had cats doing doggy stuff. And it made me think that that's what we're doing. We're being more dog, except the pack, which is the majority group, puts up a lot of resistance because they feel excluded from diversity initiatives and they perceive reverse favoritism. So you cannot be more dog. So yeah, minority groups, they face bias, they face a stereotype threat, there's an empathy gap, they have ambition gaps, they're bombarded with all these societal cues that they have to internalize, and really it's all a big pile of very much sadness. And if you think about career progression, it really depends on you taking risks and you advocating for yourself. And that's often not at the forefront of your mind, where you're just simply grateful for being allowed to be present. Diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being glad you're there. That's a quote by Aubrey Blanche that I think is really powerful. And also, I hope I have proven to you that diversity is nothing without this magical source called inclusion. And I did wonder how we're doing overall in tech. And turns out there was an easy way to find out. So Stack Overflow Developer Survey, this year's edition, 30.4% out of all surveyed ranked diversity as the lowest priority when looking for a job. Non-binary people and women, when asked to rank some factors that they would consider when looking for a new employment opportunity, they ranked company culture and office environment as the highest priority. The rest, over 90%, ranked pay as the highest priority. So the answer to how we're doing in tech is we haven't even got the bases covered. So the Stack Overflow Developer Survey was a really sad revelation for me, and I hope it's been an eye-opener for you too. But before we all emigrate to the moon, there's an obvious question that I should try to answer. The question is how? So how do we break down these barriers that stand in the way of building a truly diverse and inclusive tech industry? And we can start by acknowledging that there are things in our power that we should be doing and that we collectively are responsible to try to make things better. So what should we do? First of all, you can start by understanding your own bias, because everyone is biased. I'm biased too, and keeping your privilege in check. And this is hard because it starts with introspection, which is quite tough. And then you have to be very honest, which is even tougher. And then you also have to do a lot of research and reading, which is mostly free and on the internet. There's a website you could use called Project Implicit, and it's basically a quiz that you can take so that you understand your implicit biases towards gender, religion, sexual orientation, and many other topics. And the results might surprise you. It's very good to be aware of these things. Hire people. Hire people who care about diversity and hire them from underrepresented groups. Now, this is going to be super tough, and you're going to bump against a lot of resistance. What some people might say to you is that we can't hire them, we'd be lowering the bar. And the truth is, this bar is bullshit, because this bar is in place from a long-held position of privilege. And there was an internal study at Google that showed quite conclusively that from a hiring manager saying hire to the candidate actually turning out to be a good or bad hire, there was no good correlation from that. So the truth is that nobody in tech actually has a bar that can determine well enough whether a candidate is a good or a bad hire, regardless of gender or ethnicity. Something else some people might say, and it happens often enough even at the Financial Times, is there aren't enough minorities applying. Now, your job here is to look at that and fix it. And an obvious place to start is, say, with your job descriptions. So a lot of us will just have a list of bullet points, which makes a lot of sense, maybe, but you need to understand that those bullet points select implicitly for the majority, and the majority will apply when they meet fewer of the criteria than everybody else. That's just fact. There's a tool called Textio that you can use, and it will make you aware of some of the more obvious flaws in the language of your job descriptions. I can really recommend it. And thirdly, maybe you don't do job descriptions. Maybe you don't care about any of that. Maybe you just want to see someone's GitHub account or their contributions to open source community, or you want to see them speak on stage. Well, how many underemployed single moms do you think you're going to hire with that? Because I'd bet none. So yeah, your job is to hire the best team. And you can choose a lot of strategies to get there. But if your strategy is going to be simply to hire the best candidate for the role without looking at the composition of your team, and you end up with a weaker and less diverse team, then that strategy isn't working, it needs to change. And reach out to people, reach out to underrepresented groups. You have to actively do this. You can't expect them to reach out to you. For example, I mean, if you're after gender minorities in tech, Twitter's a good place to start. It's full of lists. Just do that. Support people, help nurture people. And you have to understand that minority groups often have to prove themselves to a far greater extent than everybody else. So there's a study by McKinsey that shows that men are promoted based on potential and women are promoted based on past achievements. So don't just hire people and let them get on with it, actually just have their back. Celebrate people, celebrate their successes. If you have a platform, if you're quite senior, if you're a speaker, if you're big on Twitter, shout about the successes of minorities in tech. Use that soapbox. And be a feminist. Be more than a feminist, actually. Cultivate your emotional intelligence, cultivate your empathy, and get familiar with your pronouns and your tampons, and just become part of the solution. Help support minorities in the workplace and at home. Take up more chores. And I have to give a shout out to this because it is an initiative founded by a colleague. Tampon Club is something that we can easily do to be more inclusive. Tampon Club is simply a group of people that places tampons and other sanitary products in corporate environments so that they are there when they may be required. Yeah, and make sure no one's left behind regardless of gender or race or ability. And that means being consciously inclusive. You have to actively create an inclusive workplace, an inclusive conference, an inclusive meetup. You have to use inclusive language, stop using guys. You have to consider the people who don't drink beer or won't have pizza. And speak up, because silence serves nobody. And speak up especially on behalf of people who can't. Maybe they can't because they lack the confidence or seniority to say that there's a problem that needs fixing. So do it for them. I got this from Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. Do what you do if you weren't afraid. And remember that we stand on the shoulders of those who were before us. Think about the suffragettes, for example. They enacted change, now it's on us. So be bold and go to the top. You will be afraid, it will be uncomfortable. It's crucial to the gaining of power that you remove internal barriers. But it's also crucial that you remain true to yourself. Remain your truest self, and it's going to be awkward, and you're going to be uncomfortable, and that is fine. I'm kind of awkward on this stage, but you're all very kind, so it's all good. And don't say frivolous things. Don't be complacent. especially as you become more senior, begin to listen to people. Speak up. People will start listening to you too. Keep an ear out for underrepresented minorities. Listen to what they're saying and go beyond your bias. When you listen to people, make sure that you get the widest variety of voices possible. For example, there's this website called Diversify Your Feed, which will analyze the gender split. It's very simple. It will analyze the gender split of the people you follow on Twitter, and that's just people, not corporate accounts. And it will give you recommendations of who to follow to broaden your views. Okay, get out of your comfort zone. Go meet people. Try and broaden your circle so that we can all benefit from feeling included. What we do at the FT, we've got a Slack bot called Donut, and every week people who are in the Coffee Roulette channel are paired up with a person they haven't met before and shipped off on a 30-minute coffee date, and it's absolutely brilliant. Everybody loves it, and it is snowballing in adoption. So, Donut. Also, attempt to get the broadest understanding you possibly can about other people's problems. Do that through reading, do that through talking. I don't mind. The only thing that you must resist is judgment and assumptions, because you're not going to be a savior. Instead, why not join a support group or start a support group and celebrate diversity and make sure it's an inclusive party for everyone in tech, because tolerating difference is not the same as embracing it. You can tweet this slide, it's got no GIFs. Thank you.
Thanks for your talk, and we invite you to have a short interview with us.
First of all, I want to say that you raised a very important theme, very important topic, and thank you very much for it. And I wanted to ask you, how can we encourage more women to study programming? How can we support them?
Encouraging more people, more women to study programming is a matter of making programming more attractive to everyone. And when we have bro cultures and when we have hacker cultures and when women are still encouraged to be quiet and compliant in school and not be assertive, that is going to be very slow. So it's all about outreach. And it's all about flipping school on its head, actually, because I was quite good in school, and I turned out to be the least confident person in the world, because the skills required by school, where you sort of nod your head and you learn everything that you need to learn and you never interrupt, those are not the skills that are valued in a workplace.
So, as a follow-up question, what can we do to invite more women to give talks? So, for example, can you share what motivated you to become a speaker?
I had a fantastic mentor. I still have a fantastic mentor, and she made me do it. So if you see someone and you see their potential, and even if you don't see their potential, if you just truly believe in them, advocate for them and show them that it's possible and try to remove any barriers in their way, because that's what happened with me, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, and just one more question. I'm really interested. For me, it's really interesting. So, for example, what to do when people create a diverse, inclusive environment, but only for themselves, and they like stop, for example, because they like think, okay, we done the good job, and that's it. Like they don't look in other places, because it's too hard, or they like think they achieved the perfection, but they only stop like in their own environment. So do you think it's a problem at all, or do you think people should think also not only in their own environment, but to look at other environments, so to speak?
People should never be as selfish. I think that's quite a utopian idea, that you can have a perfectly inclusive and diverse environment that just exists in a bubble, because the thing that really attracted me to the topic was, yeah, okay, so you get diversity of knowing people, but what about your own diversity of thought and knowledge and experience that requires interaction and empathy and a lot of skill that you're not going to get if you don't constantly strive to include others and interact with others.
Thank you.
Thank you.